So it is my turn first. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to introduce this part of our work that we published with you in Cognitive Semantics. We really feel honored to be here. The topic of this paper is irony between linguistics and literary theory. Let me go to the first slide. The first slide summarizes the main aspects of the context for our paper. The study of irony has a very long tradition in literary theory and also in rhetoric. And over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years in the philosophy of language and also in pragmatics, inferential pragmatics, especially within linguistics. Now, what we observe when we look at the literature on irony is that the literary theory camp and the linguistics camp are separate, and there are very few bridges trying to reconcile points of view, aims, and methodology. Of course, the methodology of linguistic analysis and the methodology of literary analysis is quite different, but the research goals and the topic of research is the same. So what we wanted to look for is convergence areas, meeting points for both literary theory and linguistics, and see if there was any way in which we could have positive, constructive, mutual feedback in the two camps. We first noticed that the linguistic approach is usually speaker-oriented and tends to provide very fine-grained analysis intended to formulate high-level generalizations, whereas the literary approach was receiver-oriented rather than speaker-oriented, and it was more heavily contextual and in terms of social, historical, and cultural factors. What we saw is that the two approaches could be combined if we had some meeting point. And as cognitive linguists, it was evident to us that cognitive linguistics has some tools that could be further developed to cover the main theoretical aspects of irony, both within literature and linguistics, and create that mutual feedback conditions, those mutual feedback conditions that we wanted to have. So we argue in this paper that it is possible to use cognitive linguistics as the convergence point for literary theory and linguistic analysis as far as irony, the study of irony, is concerned. This combined approach should take into account social, cultural, and historical factors. That is possible not only in literary theory, where of course that's a central point, but it is also possible in cognitive linguistics, as we will see very easily. It was necessary to have analytical delicacy. That is often missing in literary theory because they try to contextualize and look for historical connections and cultural connections, and they miss on the details of linguistic analysis. But cognitive linguistics can do that. There is no problem. In terms of communicative impact, we need to look at communicative impact from both perspectives too, and it is possible with the analytical categories provided by cognitive linguistics. And then we also think that a meeting point can be found in terms of what we call felicity in pragmatics, which is the potential for communicative success of the ironic act. And both linguists and literary theorists are interested in communicative success, but for different reasons. So because we thought that cognitive linguistics is highly sensitive to all these factors, still with different perspectives, we thought that adding the cognitive dimension to irony would be a good idea and would provide the meeting ground that we wanted to have. We also noted that there were also differences, practical differences in the way in which the notion of context, which is so important for literary theory, was taken up in either camp, in the cognitive linguistic, in the linguistic camp, and also in literary theory. In practice, literary theory and linguistics have both approached the notion of context, but in linguistics, although many linguists claim that context is very important for linguistic analysis, in practice, the analysis they carry out of context is often superficial, and it is created on an ad hoc basis as is needed for specific analytical needs. And there is no fully fledged theory of context that will allow researchers to dig into this issue more deeply. However, in literary theory, the notion of context has been dealt with a high degree of delicacy, which is not attained in linguistics. So in this part of the talk, we will discuss some of the cognitive linguistic analytical tools, and then in the second part, we will make the applications from a more literary perspective. Now, one of the analytical tools that we have in cognitive linguistics, which is very popular, is the notion of frame. And frames are defined by Fillmore and his collaborators as internal coherent schematizations of our experience of objects, characters, their properties, and relations. It is a very well-known notion, and it provides a systematic analysis of aspects of the communicative act that relate to our knowledge of the world. And this turns the context into a reality modeled by our brain rather than something objective out there that it is dissociated from how we interact through language with the world. In literary analysis, they have roughly the same approach to the communicative act and world knowledge, and they take up a notion that is complementary of this kind of approach to communication by introducing the notion of discourse community. Also, frames are dynamic and they can change as our experience, whether subjective or intersubjective, changes. For this reason, the notion of frame, is not foreign to the inclusion of social historical variables. It can accommodate well literary views like Colebrooke's, who traces the evolution of ironic uses from ancient Greece to postmodernism. Now, how have linguists dealt before this cognitive linguistic attempt that we have made at dealing with irony? How have they dealt with the notion of irony? There are quite a few possibilities, but we're going to focus our attention on two of the most prominent ones. Then one of the developments in cognitive linguistics, which is highly schematic and programmatic, and then we will introduce our own personal approach. We first have the echoic account of irony that was put forward in the 1980s, first by Sperber and Wilson within relevance theory. They claimed that irony is a case of echoic use of language. That is, a repetition of what someone else has thought or said before. And this repetition, this echoic use of language, is associated with a specific attitude, which we call the ironic attitude, which can be wry, skeptical, bitter, mocking, depending on the context. So, for example, if I think that the weather is going to be fine for an outing, and then all of a sudden I realize that it was not fine, I could say something like, oh, fine weather. And I'm repeating my own thoughts about what the weather was going to be like. But it's ironical. I do not think that it is fine weather. And I have an attitude about my previous thought. That's the basics of the echoic account of irony within pragmatics. To give you another example, imagine that you have a father and a son. The father has made a promise to his son that he would attend a very important event in which the son was going to participate for the first time, but the father fails to attend. And the son, skeptically and probably a bit angry, mutters, "Son, you can bet I'll be there," which is exactly what the father said when he made his promise. Now, this utterance, "Son, you can bet I'll be there," said by the son, not by the father, is an echo of the father's words. And it is a pretended act of promising rather than the real promise. It makes allusion to the broken promise. And in uttering, "Son, you can bet I'll be there," there is an attitudinal element that arises from the contrast, the clash between the promise made and the real situation. Another account is called the pretense account. Now, the pretense account has been developed by quite a few scholars. It originated with a paper by Clark and Garrick that took one of the elements of the Gricean approach, and which was the pretense element of speech acts, and they gave a lot of prominence to this element. They, in their view, irony results from the speaker pretending to perform a given speech act that, of course, the speaker is not actually performing. You can apply this to the previous sentence. "Son, you can bet I'll be there." The speaker is pretending to make a promise. It is the son speaking, so the son is not making any promise. So he is simply making allusion to the previous promise. Because of this connection with the notion of allusion, which is very close to the idea of echo, Kumon Nakamura and others in 1995 developed this idea of the pretense approach, and they included the notion of allusion, which is very close to the notion of echo in relevance theory. Now, what about cognitive linguistics? There are a couple of scholars, but perhaps the most prominent of the two is Sanna Coulson. And Sanna Coulson used Fauconnier and Turner's blending theory to account for irony. In Coulson's approach, they take the idea that language linguistic production is backed up by a cognitive process of merging conceptual structures. So they took this idea that is quite pervasive in metaphorical thinking, and they tried to see if it applied to irony. Now, in blending theory, when they apply blending theory, for example, to metaphor, you can have the example of think of a person that is very angry, and you talk about that person as if the person were boiling inside or was burning inside, and you could see smoke coming out of the ears of that person. You can see smoke coming out of his ears means that the person is really upset. Now, what we do here is we integrate knowledge about containers that have something burning inside and liberating, releasing smoke, and a person that is seen as the container, and the person does not release any smoke, but you can see other signs of anger, like, for example, the redness in the face, which suggests internal heat, and you make the connection and create the blend, create the merging of conceptual structures. That's quite self-evident for the case of metaphor. Now, what about irony? Well, Coulson analyzes the example, "I love people who signal." In "I love people who signal," this is uttered by a motorist that has been cut off in traffic, and of course is upset about it. The ironic meaning arises from the convergence into a conceptual blend of the motorist's expected reaction, which is punishing the driver's behavior, complaining about the driver's behavior, and a counterfactual trigger, which is the pretended compliment. Interestingly, there is a pretense element in this theory. There is a counterfactual trigger, which is the pretended compliment. And there is this convergence, this merging of two things that should not combine in principle, but can be reconciled within the blend. Now, the three approaches, the echoic approach, the pretense account, and Coulson's approach within blending theory are very interesting. And the three of them, if you combine them to some degree, give a very good picture of how we could approach irony from a rich perspective rather than a limited perspective bound to a single theory. Each of the three approaches by itself has some weaknesses. It's not unproblematic. For example, when you think of blending theory, it has some strengths, of course. One of the strengths is that it aligns irony with metaphor and with other cognitive processes, which is a good thing. But there are a couple of things missing. First, it doesn't assign any role to the observable situation. In the example about I love when people signal, there is someone that has not signaled, that has made a mistake. So we should assign a role to the observable situation and to the clash between the observable situation and what the person says. I love people who signal, but nobody signaled. And also, if you remember, in the echoic account, we had the attitudinal element. You are upset, you are skeptical, you can be mocking someone. There is an attitudinal element. And the attitudinal element is missing from the blending account. Now we go to the relevance theoretic account, which seems to be very strong, but interestingly, while of course it gives some prominence to the attitudinal element and somehow understands that there is a contrast between the echoed thought and the real situation, it is still unable to specify the inferential mechanism, the inferential procedure that gives rise to the ironic overtones. And irony is about ironic overtones. You need to explain how they arise. It's not enough to say there is an echo and an associated overtone. You have to explain how the overtone is produced. Why do people know that there is irony and not just an echo and a clash between the echo and something else? And then the notion of pretense is probably the most problematic if you want to make it just by itself without any other help from any other theory, the central feature of irony, because it is not. The notion of pretense is not a distinguishing feature of irony, because you can have pretense in just about any figure of speech. You have it in metaphor, you have it in hyperbole. If I say this suitcase weighs a ton, well, I pretend that it weighs too much and I can't carry it because it's too heavy for me. I am just pretending that it weighs an amount of kilograms, or that it has an amount of weight that it is impossible for any human being to carry. There is a pretense element there too. If you think about metaphor, it's about the same. We pretend that teeth are pearls. We pretend that eyes are the ocean, and so on and so forth. So the pretense element is common to any figure of speech because we're talking about non-literal descriptions, or non-literal approaches to what life what the real world looks like. Now, can we sort out these weaknesses? Yes. And we think that an account in terms of cognitive processes or cognitive operations would be the solution. This account borrows elements from the different theories, but it also produces its own analytical categories. Now, the first thing is that ironic expressions do echo previously held assumptions. So this would be an invariant in verbal irony. We always echo some thought, we always repeat what someone else said, or a belief that is common to people within a social system. Now, yes, but the way the notion of echo has been treated in relevance theory is not oriented to cognition. It is oriented to what people do by means of echoing. So it is oriented to the result rather than to the process. But what if we think about echoing also from a cognitive perspective as a process. And we postulate the existence of an echoing operation in the same way as we say that we have metaphorical mappings, or that we can contrast situations, and we can have quite a few mental operations that allow us to use language with a specific communicative impact. Echoing, if we define echoing as a cognitive operation, not only as a pragmatic task, consists in the reproduction of an organized conceptual structure that has been used before. And the result of echoing is an echoic expression. We have the process and we have the result. Now, irony also requires a clash between what the echoed thought and the observed situation. The echoed thought allows us to build an echoed scenario, and the observed situation is an observable scenario. So we would have a combination of echoing and contrasting, two cognitive operations that are crucial, that are central to understand irony. And as a result of the clash between the echoed scenario and the observable situation, the observable scenario, what we have is an inference on the type of attitude that the speaker has about the echoed thought. Let's move forward. And this gives rise to two possible situations. One in which the speaker expresses dissociation from the echoed scenario. Another one in which the speaker expresses dissociation from the observable scenario. And for both situations, we have the same inferential mechanism, but different world knowledge at work. Let's see how this works. We postulate the existence of reasoning schemas to explain the inferential process that explains ironic uses and the ironical attitude. In this first one, excuse me a second, I can't see the screen, now I can. We have an expression of dissociation from the echoed scenario. How does this work? Take this example. Imagine that someone says, yeah, right, Sam plays the guitar like a legend. And of course, it is not true. Sam is a poor performer. Now, this can echo someone else's beliefs about Sam and his skills in playing the guitar. Now, when you say that, of course, you dissociate yourself from the echoed thought. You don't believe that Sam actually plays the guitar well. We have two chain reasoning schemas at work here. A reasoning schema takes the form of a premise and a conclusion. The premise in this case is the echoed scenario. Sam plays the guitar very well. Sam plays like a legend. Then we have the observable scenario, that Sam is a poor player, and the clash. The clash gives rise to an initial implicated conclusion, that the speaker thinks that the hearer is wrong. That is, that Sam doesn't play well. Now, the second reasoning schema comes in now. We have world knowledge that tells us that we should not contradict other people. That is not a good idea. That is not polite to do. Unless, of course, there's an exception, unless we want to prove them wrong, or we want to express our dissociation from what they think. Now, the speaker thinks the hearer is wrong. That is the previous implicated conclusion. And this idea that the speaker thinks that the hearer is wrong works on this premise that we should not contradict people unless we think that they are wrong, to give rise to the implicated conclusion that the speaker wants to prove the hearer wrong, or to express his personal dissociation from the echoed thought. Now, we can also express dissociation from the observable scenario. I take, again, the example of, I just love people who signal, when the speaker has been cut off by another driver while driving. The first reasoning schema has as a premise the idea that drivers have to signal they have to obey traffic rules. Now, that's the echoed scenario. Here, you're not echoing what someone said, but you're echoing a social rule. You're echoing social convention. Then the observable scenario is that the driver didn't signal. And the conclusion is that the driver is in breach of traffic rules, so the driver's behavior is not acceptable. Now think of that implicated conclusion, because that's going to be part of the second reasoning schema. It is highlighted in blue color. For the second reasoning schema, you have another premise. If someone is in breach of traffic rules, his behavior is worthy of punishment or criticism. The explicit meaning, which is the previous implicated conclusion, is that the driver is in breach of traffic rules. So the driver's behavior is worthy of punishment or criticism. And that would be the final implicated conclusion. Another element of our proposal is the taxonomy of ironists and interpreters. And this is necessary for the bridge between literary theory and linguistics. We dealt with the cognitive mechanisms. Now we're going to deal with the elements of the ironic act. We have produced a typology or a taxonomy of ironist types and interpreter types. And this is very easy to understand. And of course, this is a continuum. So we have intermediate categories. We can have solitary ironists or hierarchical ironists. And we can have naive interpreters or non-naive interpreters, and then any combination of these four kinds of ironist, these two types of ironist and interpreter. What is a solitary ironist? It is an ironist that has no intention to show superiority over the interpreter. The ironist is friends with the interpreter. The ironist wants the interpreter to understand everything. Now we can have a hierarchical ironist. The hierarchical ironist uses irony not to communicate, but to show superiority over the interpreter. And what about interpreters? If the interpreter doesn't share with the ironist the interpretive clues, the interpreter is a naive one. But if the interpreter is sophisticated enough to understand the irony, that's a non-naive interpreter. It means that the interpreter has the relevant interpretive clues. Now, can we combine the two basic types of ironists and interpreters? Yes, we can. We can have solitary ironists combined with naive interpreters or with non-naive interpreters, and hierarchical ironists in the same way with naive and non-naive interpreters, and different communicative results. If we combine a solitary ironist with a naive interpreter, the ironist efforts to be understood might not always be successful. But if we combine the solitary ironist with a non-naive interpreter, there is no need of solidarity, since the interpreter already shares the relevant interpretive clues. We can have a hierarchical ironist and a non-naive interpreter, which is only useful when the ironic target differs from the interpreter. Otherwise, there is no use in building irony, since it would not be interpreted as such. And we can have a hierarchical ironist and a non-naive interpreter, which is the most relevant type of irony, intended to highlight the status of social relations. And finally, for this part, we talk about the felicity of irony. The way in which the ironist constructs the ironic act can have different degrees of felicity. And this depends very much on the interpretive clues that the hearer, that the interpreter, will have. So the degree of felicity of an ironic act is ultimately a matter of the interpreter, but also of how the ironist behaves with respect to the interpreter. It is not the same to have a solitary ironist than a hierarchical ironist. As a general rule, the ironic impact of any textual output of anything that we say as ironists is more easily recognized to the extent that the interpreter can recognize the clash between the echoed and the observable scenario. If the ironist wants to be supportive, wants to remains on the solitary side, the ironist will use gestures, tone of voice, and also extra clausal constituents like yeah and right that will signal the direction that the interpreter has to take to understand the irony. As a consequence, there can be degrees of felicity depending on how we combine these elements, or whether there is a recognition on the part of the interpreter of the echo or of the clash, or just a recognition of the echo, or there is only recognition of the clash, or there is nothing. There is no recognition of the echo or the clash, which will be an infelicitous type of ironic act. And now we go into part 2. Then this one is for Inés, and Inés is going to apply some of these insights that come from these initial developments within the cognitive linguistic framework to different uses of irony across history, many of them developed by within the world of literature.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today with Professor Ruiz de Mendoza, jointly presenting on this paper that we wrote for cognitive semantics. I joined Paco's words. It's an honor for us to be here sharing our research. So you've been learning from Paco about sort of the underlying rules and mechanisms that take place in irony, how different approaches have said different things about the same phenomenon, how some of the elements of each approach were analytically productive for ironic analysis, and what tools we could take, and how that gave rise to different typologies of ironists, of interpreters, of felicity outcomes, of combinations of both ironists and interpreters. So as you can see, irony is a fascinating phenomenon, and it has so much to say if analyzed from a comprehensive and analytically productive perspective. I'm going to be telling you today about ironic uses. Now, you probably have realized that irony is used in a very wide variety of contexts. So we use it with our family, we also use it with our friends, but you know, Greeks and Romans already used it back in the day and in the Middle Ages. So it's a resource, it's a tool that has been used in a great variety of contexts. Now, I'm going to be telling you about ironic uses. And you might be wondering, what are ironic uses? So we define ironic uses as types of irony that are envisaged, that are analyzed, looked at from a perspective that's sociocultural and historical. Some of these ironic types are developments of previous ones, and ironic uses are modulated, are given shape by the degree of felicity of the outcome of the ironists and interpreters and how they interact, as Professor Ruiz de Mendoza has explained before. Now, the key of ironic usage, we claim, is the purpose of irony, and is measured in terms of a mix of factors. For example, the impact of in the audience. Do we want to raise awareness? Do we want to mock? Do we want to attack? Do we want to claim something? And also another factor is the ironist's attitude on cultural constructs, including the medium of transmission. So as you can see, ironic uses are very broad, and we're going to analyze them a bit more. Now, we're by no means the first scholars to show fascination and interest and curiosity regarding classifying ironic usage. And I want to mention two scholars. In 1969, we have Muerke, who writes a very short book called The Compass of Irony, but in that short book, there's a very wide range of classifications of irony. And among these ironic uses, he mentions ironic modesty, irony by analogy, nonverbal irony, dramatic irony, unconscious irony, cosmic irony, self-betraying irony, irony of events, catch-22 irony, and a very long etc. Which means that Muerke realized that irony could be used in such a wide variety of contexts, but he didn't quite classify it according to the mechanisms that underlie the phenomenon. Now, another scholar is Colebrook. Claire Colebrook in 2004 writes a book called Irony, published by Routledge. And in this book, Colebrook connects ironic usage and the historical context, especially in Western literature. She is a literary scholar, so she focuses on Western literature and the use of irony. But this is already really interesting, and you might be wondering why. And the reason is that if irony is a single phenomenon and it's used differently in different contexts, it means that irony is strongly bound to the sociocultural circumstances that surround it. But that doesn't mean that the phenomenon itself changes. Their circumstances change. Now, Professor Ruiz Mendoza has been explaining that mostly literature has looked at irony in relation to the sociocultural context, which was something that it wasn't of linguistic interest before. But all these remarks by literature are really interesting, and we will see why. Now, our claim within this academic context is that we have a limited number of ironic uses, that these uses evolve throughout time and give rise to variants, to new cases, many of which can be attested in literary language. And by literary language, we mean poetry, we mean drama, we mean novels. So if irony can be defined as a single phenomenon with the same rules, and these evolve throughout time, and it's used in different contexts, it means that we have, on the one hand, basic ironic uses and readapted ironic uses, which is particularly notable because it adds two very important things in any linguistic theory, which is simplicity and homogeneity. We need a theory that is as simple as possible, that can account for the largest number of phenomena with the fewest rules possible. And we distinguish 6 ironic uses: Socratic irony, rhetorical irony, dramatic irony, tragic irony, satirical irony, and metafictional irony. And I will explain them one by one now. So to us, basic ironic uses are a limited set of ironic uses, which normally arise in earlier stages of literature. And I'm talking about the 5th century before Christ, also the Middle Ages, as literature and authorship was evolving and taking shape. And they may evolve throughout or not throughout time, giving rise to variants, which we call ironic uses. So if you see Socratic irony in postmodernism, that's a readapted ironic use. That's not a basic ironic use. And these basic ironic uses account for something very important, which is the undiscovered communicative potential of irony. Now, what is basic Socratic irony? So as you might know, Socrates was a Greek philosopher who, by the way, never wrote anything down. Anything that was written by him, but about him was written normally by Plato, who is the author of the citation I will read now. So Socrates believed that he needed to teach his pupils, to teach them the truth. Now, to him, the truth was teaching the truth was like making someone give birth to the truth. And this was called the maieutic method. Socrates' mom was a matron, and he was very interested in how we give birth, we shed light into truth. So he had a very didactic aim in the way he used irony, and that shows. He always used this recurrent formula where he was a solidary philosopher, and I'm using the terminology explained by Professor Ruiz Mendoza, where the philosopher pretends to be ignorant, feigns his own ignorance, in order for the pupil, initially naive and proud, to realize that the philosopher is wise and he is ignorant. So this is an inherently felicitous irony, because at all times and in every case, the pupil ends up realizing the truth that he is ignorant and the philosopher is wise. Let me read the citation here. And Socrates says, nay, it's more reasonable that you, the pupil, should be the speaker. For you do affirm that you know and are able to tell. Don't be obstinate, but do me a favor and reply, and don't be chary of your wisdom and instruct Glaucon here and the rest of us. So expressions such as you should be the speaker, do me a favor and reply, don't be chary of your wisdom, instruct Glaucon and I, meaning Socrates is faking his own ignorance, and that is what we call the epistemic scenario clashing with the observable scenario. That's what the pupil eventually realizes. So let me move on to the second type of irony, which is rhetorical irony. Rhetorical or rhetoric is everywhere. It's always been everywhere because of the human need to persuade. We use language to persuade, to convey an idea, to transmit information in a way that our opinion goes through. Now, it's mainly used in politics with a persuasive use, aiming at usually attacking or showing mockery, which means it's a more hierarchical type than Socratic irony, because Socrates always wanted the pupil to understand the truth. But in the case of rhetorical irony, some members of the audience, some interpreters might be excluded. Now, let me read the citation from Against Verres. Against Verres was a rhetorical treatise written by Cicero, who was an orator from ancient Rome, and he was in a trial defending the population of the island of Sicily, who had been invaded by tyrant Verres and some of his henchmen, among them Rubrius. And then Cicero tells the audience, one of Verres's followers was a certain Rubrius, a man tailor-made for the lust of this man here, who was one to track all of this down with wonderful skill wherever he went. Now, expressions such as wonderful skill are said by Cicero in order to convey the idea that he disagrees with the fact that Rubrius was a good person. They had been doing absolutely terrible things to the inhabitants of Sicily, and he uses irony to denounce, to attack this Rubrius and also Verres. Now let's move on to satirical irony. Satirical irony, which is also everywhere, also dates back from a long time ago. And it usually combines, it's a bit of everything. It combines being persuasive and it combines being didactic. So it's a bit like rhetorical irony and a bit like Socratic irony. And we use satire, and you might think of any satirical pamphlet, even nowadays, Charlie Hebdo, SNL, so many satirical TV shows and texts. What we find is criticism and contempt. It's an interesting combination because we want to attack and at the same time we want to show contempt. It's often combined with allegory and parody in order to raise awareness, to make the audience, make the interpreter aware of something that's unfair, of an injustice, or something that we just simply don't like. So here what we have is a markedly hierarchical ironist aiming at excluding some people from the interpretation of irony and including some others so that they sum up and they join your opinion. And here we have an example also from ancient Rome, where Juvenal, who is against homosexuality, is talking to a homosexual called Neverlus. Neverlus is really sad because he feels very lonely in his trade. And so Juvenal tells him, be not afraid, so long as these 7 ills of ours stand fast, Pathic friends will never fail you. From every quarter, in carriages and ships, those effeminates who scratch their heads with one finger will flock in, and you have always a further ground of hope if you fit your diet to your trade. Now, what do we find here? Juvenal saying, Pathic friends will never fail you. They will come from every quarter. They will come in carriages and ships. They will flock in to help you. But what he really means is you feel lonely because other homosexuals do not support you. Hence, criticizing homosexuality and raising awareness about how, to him, it's not something good. All right, let's move on to basic dramatic irony. Basic dramatic irony has something that's very special, which is that we've been talking about mainly verbal irony, but this is mostly situational. And I don't know if you've ever been to the theater and seen that one of the characters speaks to the audience. Unbeknownst to the other people, to the other characters on stage, they tell you information that other people don't know. So what we find here is the ironist being solidary with the audience, telling them information, but not with certain characters. And thus this requires a greater interpretive effort than any other type of irony that we've seen before, like rhetorical irony or Socratic irony. And I'm going to give you an example also. Well, this is from ancient Greece, from ancient Rome, where Plautus, in his comedy Amphitruo, is telling the story of Amphitruo and Alcmena. They're married. Alcmena is a very beautiful woman, and Amphitruo is at the wall. So during the absence of Amphitruo, Zeus, who is the king of gods, basically known for having sexual intercourse with any woman that he liked in the form of bull, gold rain, any type of any shape. He could metamorphose very easily, and in order to get to bed with the woman that he liked. And in this case, he liked Alcmena. So before Amphitruo, the actual husband, returns from war, he pretends to be the husband in order to be with Alcmena. And Mercury, his son, aside, that's the key word about dramatic irony, aside, tells the audience, I haven't yet said a single wrong word, for I was present there, and so was my father during the battle. Keep still, knight, like you have until now. Be complacent with my father. It is the best way of serving the best of gods. It is a good investment for your services. So what we find here, again, situational. The Mercury is being very solidary with the audience because we know very clearly what's happening, but is being very non-solidary with the other characters, with Alcmena especially, who doesn't know what's going on. Okay, so this will be very felicitous for the audience and totally unfelicitous for the characters on stage. Basic tragic irony. We go again to ancient Greece. In tragic irony, you might be thinking something tragic is something sad or is something that doesn't usually end well. And this is indeed the case. In tragic irony, we find that the destiny of a character is set from the beginning, and no matter what the character does, eventually the destiny will be fulfilled. Now, in Greek tragedy, Oedipus, the king, Oedipus was a baby, he was born, and the oracle told his parents, your son will kill his father and marry his mother. And so they're outraged. They send Oedipus, to a neighboring country, neighboring kingdom to be raised there. And Oedipus eventually learns about the prophecy, learns that his parents have sent him away. And without knowing, he kills a man during his journey, which turns out to be his father, and marries the widowed queen of Thebes, who is his mother. So there's no way he could avoid the prophecy. And in the end, he's very upset. He plucks his eyes out and leaves the kingdom. Now, what we have here is a tragic target. And this is especially interesting because tragic irony is born in a specific context. In ancient Greece, in theaters, people would gather and tragedies would have a cathartic effect. In catharsis, there's an empathy between the members of the audience and the protagonist. And by connecting with the protagonist, the audience is supposed to experience what it would feel like to challenge the gods or challenge destiny, which should never be challenged. So what we have here is a solidary ironist and a naive or a non-naive interpreter. And finally, the sixth type is metafictional irony. This used to be called romantic irony, but it's essentially, it's the same thing as metafictional irony, only that romantic irony was a label especially used during the Middle Ages and the early Romantic period. Now, what we have in metafictional irony is an ironist that tells you, hey, what you're reading is actually not real. Fiction is still fiction, and there's no way reality and fiction will be the same thing. It's a clash with the suspension of disbelief. So I'm going to give you an example from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where one of the tales is the tale of Sir Topas, who is a knight in an ideal world of knights and fairies, and it's a romance. Now, Chaucer, the host, interrupts the tale at one point in order to ridicule the literary genre of romances, including characters, also their grandiose and absurd plots, as well as the readers of such tales. So now that we've seen the 6 uses of irony, I want you to briefly understand how they've been readapted. Now, readapted ironic uses are later evolutions of basic ironic uses into something that's more sophisticated, that's adapted into a different context. So here, the sociocultural circumstances of a certain historical period mark how a moment, so the socio-historical circumstances mark how its irony is used, because we might have stability in politics and art, like in the Age of Enlightenment, but we also may have a subversive period where conventions are challenged, as is the case of postmodernism. And an example of Socratic irony, we find it in the TV series Columbo, which is a 21st century series or late 20th century series, where a detective, Columbo, uses Socratic irony to unveil the murder, in this case, the murderess. Now, in The Sex and the Married Detective, a sex therapist, which you can see on the lower image, and murders her cheating lover by disguising as the lady in black, a high-class prostitute. She's clever and sophisticated, but Columbo eventually traps her into confessing the murder through Socratic irony. Dr. Joan, the sex therapist, says, "Do you think less of me?" And in Lieutenant Columbo replies, "Ma'am, I'm just a policeman. Judging people, that's all up to someone else. But I have to say I've enjoyed our talks very much, and I think I do understand." Now, by using Socratic irony, he makes Dr. Joan confess, just like Socrates back in the day made the students realize that they were ignorant by feigning his own ignorance. In the case of readapted rhetorical irony, we have simply the fact that persuasion is something that we've had all throughout time. As I said, is ubiquitous because the human being needs to persuade, has this urge to convey the opinion and persuade other people. And so this is very common in politics. And I have an example from a speech by Obama, where he says, "I feel happy for the state of Wisconsin. You've had a lot of commercials about Governor Romney's sales pitch." Now, what we have here is Obama mocking the campaign, the electoral campaign of Governor Romney's, the enemy candidate of Obama in the elections. In the case of readapted satirical irony, we find one clear example, who is Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. And in this pamphlet, Jonathan Swift denounces the unfair treatment of British politics on Ireland. And so the narrator of this pamphlet pretends to be a high-class British man, Englishman, and suggests turning Irish children into food so that the English can eat them to solve the famine. And he says, "I therefore humbly offer it to public consideration that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be served for breed." So in this case, what we find is a very, just like we found in Juvenal, criticizing, mocking, and showing contempt towards British policies by pretending to agree with those British policies. In the case of readapted tragic irony, I brought you an example of a novel by Thomas Hardy entitled Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a woman who undergoes a long list of bad events. She has miscarriages, she's abandoned by her lovers, then remarried someone that she doesn't love, all sorts of bad things. But in the end, when she finds love, She is killed and imprisoned and then killed by the police. And the final line by the narrator is, justice was done, and the president of the immortals, God, had ended his sport with Tess. Meaning that no matter how much she tried to be good, all sorts of bad things happened to her, and she would eventually have a tragic ending. How about readapted metafictional irony? I brought you a Spanish example because I always like to add at least one Spanish example. And this is the case of Don Quixote de la Mancha, who is Alonso Quijano, is a man who loves to read chivalry novels. And then eventually he believes he's one of those knight errants and takes one of the men in his village to be his servant, and they embark in this adventure where they imagine all sorts of perils that actually do not exist. And he takes the name of Don Quixote de la Mancha. So in this book, throughout the plot, he eventually finds somebody who's written a novel about Don Quixote de la Mancha, breaking this illusion of fiction and denouncing or criticizing the foolishness that arises from the wrong interpretation of the protagonist's fiction. He believed so much he was a knight errant, and he should realize that it's all something stupid and reality is not fiction. Now, I want to briefly, because we don't have that much time, I'm going to briefly show you how the reasoning schemas that Professor Ruiz de Mendoza explained, I'm going to explain how they apply to two of these examples. Now, I want first to take the example of both examples of rhetorical irony. First of all, in the case of Cicero, one of Verus's followers was a certain Rubrius, a man tailor-made for the lusts of this man there, who was wont to track all of this down with wonderful skill wherever he went. In this case, what we find is first reasoning schema. Premise 1. Cicero expresses his belief that Rubrius was a man of wonderful skill. Explicit meaning 1, Cicero is meant to attack Rubrius at the trial. And the implicated conclusion derived from this is that Cicero does not mean to praise Rubrius's behavior. In the second reasoning schema, we have the sociocultural convention already explained by Professor Ruiz de Mendoza, which says that we should not contradict other people unless we want to prove them wrong, which is very impolite, or to express our attitude of dissociation from what they say or think, which is still impolite, but less so. We have explicit meaning 2, which is the previously implicated conclusion. Cicero does not mean to praise Rubrius's behavior. And the implicated conclusion 2 is that Cicero wants to express his dissociation with regard to Rubrius's allegedly wonderful behavior. Again, in the second example of rhetorical irony, we find in Obama's speech, I feel happy for the state of Wisconsin. You've had lots of commercials about Governor Romney's sales pitch. In the first reasoning schema, we have the premise, number 1 premise. Obama feels happy for the state of Wisconsin getting publicity about Romney's candidature. Explicit meaning 1, Obama is a Democrat and he's against Romney's candidature since he's a Republican candidate. And the implicated conclusion, which is that Obama does not feel happy for the state of Wisconsin getting publicity about Romney's candidature. In the second reasoning schema, we find premise 1, we should not contradict other people unless we want to prove them wrong or to express our attitude of dissociation. The explicit meaning 2 is the previous implicated conclusion, just like in the previous example. Obama does not feel happy for the state of Wisconsin getting publicity about Romney's candidature. And the implicated conclusion 2 is Obama wants to express his dissociation that Wisconsin is lucky to get publicity about Romney's candidature. So as you can see, the reasoning schemas, the structure of the reasoning schemas explained by Professor Ruiz de Mendoza in part 1 of this talk applies totally seamlessly to examples of irony in different contexts, as you've seen with a case of basic ironic use in the case of Cicero, and a readapted use of irony in the case of Obama. And now I will move on to the conclusions. Now, the conclusions are the following. An explanatorily adequate account of irony benefits from joining linguistic and literary perspectives. An account of irony should take the receiver and the interpreter as both very important elements of the communicative act, because this opens the door to studying ironist and interpreter types, which is strongly needed in an account of irony. Second, as an echo-based phenomenon, irony relies on the knowledge the interpreter has, both in terms of culture and communication, and the ability of the interpreter to engage, to participate in the ironic game. So the proposed approach combines the finer-grained, more analytical linguistic methodology and the more contextual literary view. Cognitive linguistics, in this case, provides a perfect meeting point between the literary and linguistic approaches. The approach we have explained explains irony from the point of view of cognitive modeling, looking at the phenomenon of irony from the perspective of the cognitive operations that are involved in how we produce and interpret irony, provides a greater, more comprehensive perspective of the phenomenon, allowing a greater degree of explanatory adequacy that previous cognitive linguistic accounts had not reached. And finally, cognitively and communicatively, the elements of irony may be combined in different ways, which results in a variety of possible outcomes. Hence, ironic effects result from creating, contrasting, echoed, and observable scenarios. And these factors and the recognizability of echoed scenarios enable us to determine how felicitous the irony is, and felicity turns out to be gradable. And to conclude, some ironic uses, as you have seen, have appeared and reappeared in different time periods, and this has allowed us to make the distinction between basic and readapted uses of irony, where readapted uses of irony result from the adaptations required by the sociocultural requirements of such periods. Thank you very much. You have the references here. Thank you for your attention.